Yeah, definitely. So, one great resource that's out there right now is called Stop AAPI Hate. It's a website that's been put together by the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council, and they're just collecting a bunch of reports. Whoever wants to report anti-Asian sentiment or racism, harassment, shunning, even physical assaults. So in 1 month of collecting incident reports, Stop AAPI Hate received almost 1,500 reports of these types of incidents. And that was only at the beginning of April. So I'm sure that number has probably doubled by this point. And as with most instances of violence, whether that's verbal or physical, there tends to be underreporting always. So I wouldn't be surprised if the number is much higher than that.
Absolutely. And speaking of Stop AAPI Hate, that was, an initiative put on by the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council. And I'm actually going to be speaking next week, NowThis viewers, to the executive director. Her name is Manjusha Kulnari. And she's going to be speaking to us on more of like a policy level about what it means to be documenting and finding a way to reverse and also curb these instances of hate. But to your point, Cathy, it's really important for us to think about what it means for someone to even come and report. Like a lot of communities are, afraid of coming to authority with these things, or there is a kind of like an unspoken code to, not bring these things up, to not like cause any trouble or cause any extra burden on someone who's already been a victim of discrimination or a hate crime. But, I think right now, luckily, there's been a lot of media coverage and attention and a lot of political coverage and attention on what this means and what lawmakers and city officials can be doing and government officials can be doing to protect Asian American communities and to keep perpetrators accountable for their actions. Cathy, what have you seen on the federal and the state level regarding this issue?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think on one hand, we see how political discourse can really inflame these anti-Asian sentiments. We see this from things that Donald Trump has been saying, even just little language things like calling it the Wuhan virus or the China virus. CAS AAPI is suspicious or at fault for the pandemic, which is completely uncalled for. But on the flip side, we've seen a lot of action, both on the ground and in Congress to denounce these sort of acts. For example, there's one letter that over 260 AAPI and civil rights organizations have co-authored and signed that's calling on Congress to denounce anti-Asian and anti-Asian American racism that's emerged from COVID. And a dozen Senate Democrats have also called for federal action on anti-Asian racism. So there's a lot of movement happening on various levels to address this issue.
Absolutely. And I want to bring us to a viewer question. Somebody, asked us or told us through our question box, I am an Asian person, and I know people who downplay the risk of racial violence against Asians, and they gaslight me. Where does this sentiment come from? And could you unpack for us, Cathy, how something like this, something where folks are feeling like Asian Americans maybe don't receive any racism, or, this isn't like a real thing? Like, what do you have to say about that? And where is this gaslighting coming from?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is something that's extended far beyond this period of COVID. The idea that Asian Americans can be subjected to racism and discrimination and honestly to forces of white supremacy is something that we haven't given a lot of attention to. I think it's really important to keep in mind that different communities of people of color face racism and discrimination in different ways, whether it's explicit person to person or on a systemic institutional level. And I think it's the fact that Asian Americans are seen as not facing that as often that we can often feel like we're actually not subject to these forces. I wanted to bring up, there's a Korean American poet, Cathy Park Hong, who recently came out with a book talking about this idea of minor feelings. And I just wanted to read out a quote from that because I think that speaks really well to the idea of being gaslighted. She describes minor feelings as emotions we are accused of having when we decide to be difficult. In other words, when we decide to be honest. When minor feelings are finally externalized, they are interpreted as hostile, ungrateful, jealous, depressing, and belligerent, affects that are ascribed to racialized behavior that whites consider out of line. Our feelings are overreactions because our lived experiences of structural inequity are not commensurate with their diluted reality. So I think part of this goes to talking about the idea of the model minority myth and the idea that Asian Americans have reached some level of socioeconomic success so that we don't face racism in these broad ways. And I think this is the reason, and this is the basis for a lot of the gaslighting or feeling that we need to downplay the racial violence that we're feeling.
Absolutely. And for folks who might not be familiar with, a more literal definition of what the model minority entails, can you tell me a little bit more about that term, kind of where it came from, how it operates, and how it affects not only the AAPI community, but other communities of color, especially in places like America?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the model minority myth is exactly that. It's a myth, it's a stereotype that's really harmful and has been debunked many times, but is still really widespread. And it's a stereotype that Asians and Asian Americans are a monolith, so one cohesive group that are more socioeconomically successful than other racial and ethnic minority groups. And that's along dimensions like income, health, education level, things like that. But I think what's really important is to talk about two implications that this has, that this model minority myth has. The first is that the AAPI sort of umbrella term actually encapsulates over 50 ethnicities who demonstrate a really wide range of inequality and disparities in terms of poverty, education, and health. So we're not all this one cohesive group that has achieved the socioeconomic success. But beyond that, the model minority myth is very much an idea that's rooted in anti-Blackness, anti-brownness. It's a tool of sort of this broader sense of white supremacy that is used to diminish the struggles of other communities of color. And honestly, it helps prevent solidarity between communities of color. And in that way, I think it's extremely harmful, and we need to start deconstructing the model minority myth.
Absolutely. Thanks for providing like a kind of broken down definition of that and what it means for the greater landscape of communities of color. I think, to your point, part of making things better for all communities of color and all marginalized groups is to, lift each other up, whether or not we might identify with their culture or their heritage or their ethnicity. I think it really is important not only to understand why the model minority myth has, been fracturing groups, but what it signals to the rest of us to what we can do to, mitigate the effects of something like the model minority or, that umbrella idea. And, this fits like a little bit in with the rest of the viewer questions that we got. Somebody told us, a really sad, they're sad to me, anecdote of their Asian neighbor leaving goodie bags with a little note stating that his family hadn't visited China recently. Like a neighbor, like an Asian neighbor who felt the need to step forward and already overcompensate for the fact that they were assuming people were maybe afraid of them or they felt the need to explain themselves. And it kind of reminded me a little bit of, something that my friend Curtis brought up to me, which was that his reaction to racist comments and microaggressions sometimes is, but I'm not Chinese. And he wants to kind of know where this like reflex comes from, and he wants to know how he can do better. So could you help me unpack, that anecdote of the neighbor leaving goodie bags, and then also move a little bit into maybe what Curtis is thinking as he's processing, racial comments and microaggressions?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that anecdote is really sad. Honestly, it makes me think of like my parents and people of their generation who might do something like this because they feel like they do need to overcompensate and prove their Americanness. I wanted to take a step back and talk about this idea of another myth or another stereotype that's attached to Asian American communities, and that's of the perpetual foreigner. It's this idea used to other Asians and Asian Americans, suggesting that any Asians who live in the US are still fundamentally foreign, fundamentally different, and can never be fully American, perhaps because they always retain loyalty to whatever country they or their families immigrated from. And this anti-Asian racism and xenophobia is not new, right? We know that throughout US history, it's emerged in different forms. There is the Chinese Exclusion Act, there is Japanese internment. Even more recently, post 9/11, Islamophobia has affected a lot of Asians and South Asians in particular. So this idea that we're not American, or that we are other and that we're dangerous, that we're suspicious, can be the root of this feeling to reassure others, this need to overcompensate for what we lack or what we're told that we lack. But at that point, I also want to talk about this idea of respectability politics. And I think this goodie bag incident really lends itself well to a discussion of that. And this is the idea that some, and this includes even politicians like Andrew Yang, who wrote an op-ed a month or so ago saying that it's the role of Asian Americans to step up and combat racism and xenophobia by proving our commitment to the US, by proving our patriotism, to being as American as we can be in this moment, to show people that there's nothing to be afraid of. But that completely puts the onus on us to demonstrate that we're sort of worthy of not receiving racism. And I think that's really inherently violent. And that's not where the onus should be. That's not where the responsibility should be. It should be on all of us collectively as a community to combat this, not just on the people who are on the receiving end. And then to the anecdote from your friend Curtis, saying that he has this sort of reflex to respond when he is on the receiving end of anti-Asian or anti-Chinese comments, is that it's really important to remember that AAPI are not a monolith. We're not one singular group. And talking about sort of unpacking this and unflattening the community is a really important conversation that's been going on and needs to continue going on. But I think in this instance, it's more crucial to step back and think about how just saying I'm not Chinese is complicit in this anti-Chinese, anti-Asian sentiment. It still is sort of pushing the blame on one group, and that's Chinese and Chinese Americans, saying that me, because I'm not Chinese, I don't deserve to be singled out or targeted, but they are because they are from China or their families are from China. So I think it's really important in this moment to have broad AAPI solidarity as well as solidarity with other communities.
Absolutely. Thanks for answering some of those questions. I'm curious, if Curtis ever found himself in one of these situations again where he is noticing, an AAPI friend or even himself like experiencing anti-Asian discrimination or maybe like a hateful comment, what should Curtis do or what can he do next time to bring something more productive and positive to that interaction?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think there's no clear one right answer. I think it depends on the situation. It depends on who's being targeted and what would be helpful for them in that moment. But I think some things we can think about are, number one, we can think about bystander intervention strategies. There's lots of resources out there. I think there's a standard 5 Ds of bystander intervention. The first is distract. The second is delegate. Third is document, fourth is delay, and the fifth is to direct. So there's various steps that you can take, and there's sort of a template for that, so you know how to react in these situations. And I find that often, even just the idea of documenting, whether that's with your presence or pulling out a phone, can make people feel aware that they're being watched and perhaps watch their actions and what they're saying a little bit more closely. So that's just one example, and we can talk a little bit more later about other ways to respond.
Yeah, absolutely. And I, to your point, I think it's really important to recognize that this is a group like fight. This is something that everybody in every community can actually think about and choose good reactions and decisions after witnessing or being a victim of, hate or discrimination or even assault. to curb any of these things from happening. It's not, like you said, up to the AAPI community to have to fend for themselves and to have to convince their neighbors that they're not going to hurt them or that they're not carrying a virus. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this as we move on to how bystanders and allies can help us in this fight. But it's important for everyone to understand that this is something that we can all solve together if we're willing to listen and we're, connected with the right tools. This whole conversation we've been having connects with another viewer comment that echoes a lot that we've been talking about. As an Asian person, this person found themselves trying to be overly polite to white people in their community when they were out shopping for essentials, at the grocery store or something. And it's something that I have done, I think, all my life. Like, even growing up, I just didn't want to give anyone a reason to target me because I was like that Asian girl, or like some kind of like a Chinese foreigner, something that was like, it was always like a fear of mine to be defined by my outward appearance, which none of us can control. What do you think would be helpful for folks, like me, I guess, or our viewer who had that question, in how they should change their, change their perspective when they're going out to shop, even though they might be afraid to do so or feeling like they need to tread lightly?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this comment resonates very deeply. I've found myself doing the same exact thing when I go out, especially when I'm just taking like a walk around my neighborhood, and I live in a very white neighborhood. I sort of have started counting the times that I step out of the sidewalk to let other people pass. And I often do it when we're super far apart, like it's not even necessary to cross the street yet, but I feel this internal sort of pressure or guilt that I need to like avoid potential like racial encounters because I have experienced those as well. So I think this is something that's really deeply internalized, and it's been internalized through our whole lives, like you've been saying, that we feel like we need to make ourselves palatable to white folks or to other people, and make ourselves sort of like submissive or whatever, a lot of problematic things. And I think in this moment, again, it's really hard for us to come out and just change the way that we're seeing things or change the way that we're thinking, because it's very much rooted in structural racial relations. And I think this is a moment where it's really important to call out to like white folks and other people that it's important when you're engaging with Asian American folks in this time to be aware of that weird power dynamic and that weird pressure. And perhaps you can be the one that crosses the street first and not have to rely on Asian American folks to be making all of those concessions.
Absolutely. Thanks for that. And moving on, I'm curious to know, what has been the conversation that you've been having maybe among your friend groups or like your, AAPI community, if you, connect closely with one where you're based. I know that I myself have been sharing with my Asian friends and my friends who aren't Asian about the kind of stresses and anxieties that I have about all of this rising racism and what it means, for the long run and how this can compound. And I found myself being really hesitant or not knowing where to start in talking with my parents about this. And I'm curious to know how you've been navigating unpacking all of this stuff, once you get home and you're like, God, like I have to tell you about this one thing that happened to me. This lady did this, or this guy said this. How have you been coping in, balancing your own mental health, and how have you seen it in the kind of workings of your own communities?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so luckily, one of my housemates is Asian American. So anytime one of us goes for a walk or goes to the grocery store and we experience something, we come back and we just rant about it. And I think that's really important, to just be able to have someone to talk to about these experiences, whether they're Asian American or not, just sort of a listening and a sounding board for what you felt, what you experienced, what you're thinking. Because in talking that out, you can unpack and realize that it's not just a one-off situation. It has nothing to do with you as an individual, but it's these broader structural issues that we have with race in this society. And in particular, I have like a few very strong Asian American communities, and when we Skype or Zoom or whatever, it's kind of a joke, but we'll just check in and be like, hey, have you experienced any like racism recently? And for the most part, each of us has something to say, which is, you know, just really discouraging, but it's really nice to have that community of people that understand what you're going through and are willing to listen and talk through it with you. And on this note of talking to your parents, I think that's really important. I think talking about mental health and talking about racism in the Asian American community has always been something that's been difficult. It's been sort of silenced or shrouded in shame, or even shrouded in this idea of the model minority myth, that we're sort of above all of this, we're beyond all of this. And for that reason, because we don't talk about it very much in our families and our communities, there's a lot of misconception and minimization of mental health concerns, and especially as they relate to racism. I have talked to my parents fairly regularly throughout this. Of course, they're all checking in like everyone's parents do during this time. But what I've noticed is that I think they're concerned for my safety in a way that they haven't been before. And a lot of it has to do with they're seeing in the news like how Asian Americans are being affected, how they're being targeted, how they're being attacked in various ways as a result of the racist discourse about COVID. And the way that they show their care for me is being like, hey, like, how's everything going? Like, I want you to be safe. Like, wear a mask, like, watch out for people. You never know, like, what can happen. And I was thinking of this weird analogy of like, in like diaspora discourse, we always talk about how our parents growing up, maybe it was difficult or weird for them to say like, I love you straight out, but they would like slice up fruit and like bring it to you while you were studying or whatever. And that was a show of their love. And I feel like in a weird way, like them caring about my safety so much during this time is a way of showing their love and showing that like, I recognize that this is difficult for you and for us. And like, we're feeling unsettled, we're feeling unsafe, and we want to just check in and make sure that you're doing okay. And I think the reverse is true. We need to check in with our parents. We need to check in with our family, with our loved ones who might be impacted by this as well, and help them process how Asian Americans are on the receiving end of racism as well, and how this is part, again, of a broader picture of sort of racist ideologies and structures in the US.
Absolutely. And I love your anecdote, the cutting fruit. I can't even tell you how many times my mom's like wandered into my bedroom and I'm like doing AP bio homework, being like, here's some like pears or like watermelon or something. And it's such a universal thing and it's so funny, but you're right. There is such a deeper meaning behind that. And in a similar kind of way, you know, my dad recently in like the last month, instead of just, you know, outright being like, hey, are you feeling safe when you walk the streets? There's like a lot of anti-Asian discrimination and hate. He's been just sending me links to articles that like generally are talking about that in like the family group text, but like there's no like open conversation about that. And it's funny because, you know, like your parents or my parents, my dad is a Chinese Malaysian immigrant and, you know, he was able to navigate, you know, the murky channels of America to get to a spot where, you know, he felt like he could be safe and confident and provide for his family. But, you know, as a young child, I saw and witnessed ways that other people acted around my parents or acted to my parents. And it was never, you know, a spoken thing if like there was like a tense, weird incident at the supermarket or like some parent at the school like made a really like snide comment that had racial overtones. Like it didn't ever break into like a more candid conversation. And you know, like you said, like mental health has been something that's really hard for a lot of Asian communities to break into discussing. It's an uncomfortable thing. And, you know, sometimes this is culturally or sometimes, you know, it's just based on, you know, a family or a general community. Like there's this there's this fear of like bringing up emotion or having to deal with emotion, in the way that, folks might want to lead a practical life or, do what they have to do to get through the day. And I think that, as racist occurrences and all this stuff begins to start like peaking throughout, the summer, as we're not out of the woodworks with COVID yet, the lasting effects of, poor mental health from not unpacking these issues is really dangerous. And to your point, I totally believe that we should be reaching out to our parents as much as, they might be checking in on us. And a lot of us, our parents don't live near us or they're away. Like I know like some of our viewers, one of them was saying, I'm scared for my elderly parents. They live in a really different and predominantly white state. And like, they are feeling anxieties about how to, care for them or check in with them. And someone else, said, my friend's mom has refused to go out in public since quarantine started due to just the fear of being Asian in public. What are some kind of conversation starter points or, I guess mock scenarios and how you and I, members of the AAPI community, we can reach out to our parents to actually have a more meaningful check-in?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think both of these anecdotes from the audience are things that I relate to and that I've experienced with my parents as well. I know one time that sort of like broke my heart. My dad was just doing one of his check-ins and he was like asking how many people in the Bay Area were wearing masks. And he was saying that he felt weird wearing a mask because he didn't want to be discriminated against or targeted or singled out because, and I think he was implying because he was Asian. So I think this is like very much the first time that maybe we're talking to our parents about issues of racism and how that can affect our mental health. I wanted to give a little bit of background about mental health in the Asian American community to sort of set up how we can have these conversations with people in our families or people in our communities more broadly. So AAPIs are actually the least likely out of any racial or ethnic group to report mental health issues and seek mental health services. This is a study using data from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. So Asian American folks report mental health issues at about half the rate of the US average. But again, like for reasons that we were talking about before, reporting doesn't mean the same thing as incidence. And I think this underreporting is likely due to a lot of the stigma attached to mental health and talking about mental health in our communities. And then another really interesting thing is that second generation AAPIs, like myself, are almost twice as likely to report mental health issues than first generation immigrants. So that's people like my parents. And I think, again, a lot of this stems from maybe we have been socialized or taught to recognize that mental health is a really important part of our general well-being, just like our physical health is. But our parents aren't as much aware of that. And that's something that we should, if we feel comfortable, talk to them about. And then finally, even controlling for the prevalence of mental illness. AAPI folks seek mental health services less than any other group. It's actually that Asian American folks are 3 times less likely to seek mental health services than white folks. And this is obviously a huge problem because these mental health issues need to be addressed in a professional and systemic way. And the reason why AAPI cited in the study that they were more likely to not seek mental health services is because they have a low perceived need, they're facing structural barriers, they think that services don't help. So these are all things that we should really talk about seriously and unpack seriously as individuals and as families and as communities. And maybe even just throwing out some of these stats when you're talking with your parents helps them see sort of the structural breadth of this issue, the fact that this is something that's happening across all Asian American communities to different levels within different ethnic groups. But overall, we're not talking about mental health. We're not talking about how we can address mental health issues, and we need to start doing that.
Absolutely. And as you're providing this explanation, where a lot of our viewers are chiming in, I have a few comments and related questions to that. But one of our viewers, was saying, aside from checking in on elders in the community, how do we talk to them about the importance of addressing mental health? And I hope that we answered your question. As Cathy was just saying, like, it's important to let them know that, there is significance and an importance in reaching out for resources. And I think, Cathy, you had just suggested, maybe even like telling them about some of these stats will maybe like open their eyes to, maybe unlocking a bit that they've been too hesitant to reveal or to reach out or get help for. And there was another person who wrote in to us in the comments, and they said, I lived in New York City for 35 years, and I never felt I was discriminated or talked down to until now. I was never afraid of anything, but I'm fearful for my teenage daughter who only knows herself as American before Asian American. And she is concerned about, or he or she is concerned about, the attacks that might be happening in the future. They want to know how they can explain to, their daughter how to deal with all of this. Should they fight it off? Should they ignore it? Like, how do you, as we're talking about, this is an intergenerational fight. How do we speak to the younger generation about these kinds of issues to, prep them for what they might face in the future?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a tough one. And I think it's a question that all people of color and communities of color have faced in one way or another over time. I think it's interesting that this person is from New York City, and you're right there right now. I'm in the Bay Area. These are all places that we think of as being seemingly progressive beyond racism, explicit racism at least. And we're seeing that that's not the case. And I think one way that really helps me think about this issue is that to sort of decenter myself and my individual interactions and realize that this is a pattern, this is a trend, and this is something that's rooted in something much deeper than just me and the person that I'm talking to on the street. This is something that's built into our institutions, the way that neighborhoods are zoned, the way that schools are funded, the way that healthcare is accessed. Race orients a lot of the way that we experience the world. And once you start uncovering the ways that that happens and you become more aware of it, you can think about more systemic ways to fight it, whether that's through policy, research, community organizing. When it becomes something beyond yourself, I think, is when you really start to develop the power to think about it on a larger scale.
Thanks for answering that. And this leads really perfectly into the next topic that we wanted to tackle, that racism isn't new in America for Asian Americans, but it also isn't new for a lot of other communities of color. How can we make sense of this spike in hate in the greater and sometimes ugly landscape of racism in America? You were talking about things like access to healthcare, things like neighborhood zoning, to school funding. There are a lot of systematic things that can put people at varied and unfair advantages and disadvantages in our society. For folks like, for example, like my parents who, have been fortunate enough to be comfortable financially and, put their children through school, like things like that. There is sometimes like this gap in understanding that like this fight really is a group fight for all communities of color, wherever they stand on the ranks, and even allies and folks who aren't of color. What do you have to say about how this fits in with the larger picture of race in America?
I think that we're in a really interesting and potentially powerful moment in U.S. history, at least for Asian Americans, that people are realizing that racism impacts them in the same way that it impacts a lot of other people. Or I think that, like, for example, our parents becoming sort of aware of the explicit racism that they're facing might be a gateway for them to understand the systemic racism that they face and that other communities of color face. So there's this opportunity to open up discussion about these topics and sort of start dismantling the racial United States from solidarity, from building solidarity with one another. And I will say that there's been really great demonstrations of solidarity from other people of color and other communities of color and other marginalized groups in the US as Asian Americans are facing disproportionate amounts of being targeted for being Asian American during COVID. And I think that AAPIs are starting to realize that they're not immune to these systems of racial oppression. And in the same way that these other communities are stepping up for us, we really need to do the same thing. We need to all stand together in solidarity against these systems of racial oppression. For example, the Black, Asian, and Hispanic House Caucus chairs have all united against COVID racism. They've taken a stand against rhetoric that's promoted racist association between the disease and people's ethnicity or race. There's sort of collaborations between different community organizations that are offering bystander training that's tailored towards anti-Asian sentiments. Other communities are standing in solidarity with us. And I think in this moment, we also need to take a step back and look at how COVID is disproportionately impacting other communities, Black communities, Brown communities, Indigenous communities, and how this is all an extension or all just an instantiation of the way that racist policies and practices in the US take place. For example, the CDC has shown that COVID affects Black Americans at exceptionally high rates. It's not an equalizer, but it's really a magnifier of inequality. 30% of patients for COVID in the US are Black, although Black folks only make up 13% of the US population. So they're extremely overrepresented in that population. The Navajo Nation, another example, has the highest COVID infection rate in the US. And then there's also all of the structural barriers that emerge in communities of color. There's food deserts, there's lack of access to good health care, there's under-resourced schools as kids try to navigate this online Zoom era of schooling. And a lot of people from these communities are essential workers that are having to put themselves and their families at risk day to day just to go to work and make an income. So there's a lot of ways that Asian Americans broadly aren't being affected by COVID, that other communities of color are, and vice versa. And we need to be aware of that. We need to talk about that. And we need to think about ways that we can stand together and for each other in these times.
Absolutely. And I really think it's valuable that you brought up, that, COVID has exacerbated racial inequalities for a lot of different groups. Like you were talking about, food deserts, to access to healthcare, to communities that are, facing the highest levels of COVID infections. It's disheartening to hear, but I think that it's a stark reminder that this is something that affects all marginalized groups. And it's just something that we can all work together to fight against and fix. Like this, racism towards one group or inequality toward one group, on varied levels, like those exist. But I think at the end of the day, if we can recognize, everyone's struggles and the importance of voicing those issues and standing up for each other, I think that on a small scale and on a bigger scale could lead to really important change. And hopefully, I don't even want to say it, but the next time a pandemic rolls around, we don't have to be grappling with so many other issues, along with the fact that there is like a life-threatening virus like hanging around. I think that it's so important that we recognize that. And I love that you're pushing the point that, unity is truly our best friend in this scenario. And that kind of leads me to where, folks that aren't of Asian descent or folks who aren't of color can do in this whole situation. We received a lot of comments from allies and questions from them about, what can I do? Like, I might not be facing racism. Might not be facing like direct discrimination from any of this COVID stuff or ever. Folks are asking, how can people outside of the AAPI community help? And, how as an ally can I be there for my friends who are facing issues?
Yeah, so I think one thing that I touched on earlier is really educating yourself on good strategies for bystander intervention. Depending on the situation, you may feel more or less safe or at risk intervening in more explicit or implicit ways. So it can be things that are as surface level as just pulling out your phone and documenting something that's happening to let someone know that they're being watched. Or it could be something more explicit, like actually stepping in and being like, hey, what you said is not okay, what you're doing is not okay. And honestly, like, I think it is the role of non-Asian folks to step in and do this sometimes, because there is that power dynamic that's involved in interactions between Asian folks and people that are harassing them or attacking them. And to have someone else from the outside who's not a part of that interaction, who's not a part of that community, step in and say, hey, this is wrong, I think is really important and really powerful. I think another thing to do is that people should be willing to directly address and correct racist discourse. So the way that we use language to talk about this, I gave the examples earlier about calling it the China virus, or like people have made like bad puns and jokes about it. And even in those instances where you think it's a joke, I think it's really important to step in and be like, this isn't something that should be joked about. Like, jokes can still perpetuate really harmful stereotypes that can lead to people getting hurt. And that can happen in person, that can happen online. Just simple correcting people is really valuable. And then another way I think that we can address these issues, or that allies can help out in this moment, is that you can provide mutual aid to AAPI communities. You can support local businesses and restaurants. I know, at least early on, I read really, really sad articles about how like Chinatowns were being affected by this. Like, no one was going anymore, and they were having to dig really far deep into their savings to pay their staff. So in these moments, you can always order food from those places, support them in that way. But then there's also ways that you can volunteer in Asian American communities, particularly I think with older Asian folks who might not have access to social networks or to their families nearby. Just volunteering. I think there's ways to just like talk on the phone with people. You can donate. There's lots of ways to really like materially help out, in addition to the ways to sort of ideologically address racist discourse.
Absolutely. And at the end of the day, what do you think could be the lasting impact of folks turning from bystanders into allies, folks who are like witnessing these things, but then actually choosing to step in, like whether it's everything from, like you said, like donating and helping AAPI communities, or, correcting a friend who says something that's really outright racist, or maybe even just a microaggression. Like, what do the small steps and the big steps mean in the bigger picture of fighting anti-Asian hate?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, for example, times that my white friends have checked in with me to make sure that I'm doing okay, or that have listened to me talk about racist experiences that I've had, or have been willing to call out other people that they see that are doing racist things or anti-Asian things, that has just shown me that people care, that people recognize that the experiences I'm facing and the feelings that I'm feeling are valid. And I think that's really important. This goes back to that initial comment about feeling like you need to downplay your experiences of racism, feeling that you're being gaslighted, because what you're feeling maybe isn't actually that real, maybe isn't actually that serious. I think by being really strong allies and having those people in our lives as Asian American folks, we can start to sort of chip away at that feeling that we can't talk about our experiences, that our experiences aren't meaningful. And then at the same time, again, I really want to go back to this point of building solidarity with other communities of color. I think that reaching across the aisles, sort of taking down the model minority myth and all the anti-Blackness that comes with it will help us build stronger communities that we can address these things on interpersonal levels, as well as on more systemic levels, at a policy and practice level.
Absolutely. And could you run by for me, what are the, steps that bystanders can take? I know we mentioned a little bit about this earlier, but for folks who are listening and watching and being like, oh, well, I didn't even realize that I could have done something in that moment. I want to be ready for when, unfortunately, I witness another instance of anti-Asian hate or hate towards any member of any marginalized community. Like, what can folks do? Like, are there any steps for this?
Yeah. So there's 5 steps, and again, there's resources online, and we'll talk about them a little bit later and link them in the comments as well. But the first one is to distract. So this could be something that's small, like pointing someone towards something else that's happening, or I don't know, making a scene in some way that feels meaningful. The second is to delegate. So if you yourself don't feel personally safe or comfortable intervening by yourself, you can pull in other people around you and be like, hey, would you mind coming with me? Or would you mind stepping in to address this issue? I know I personally have faced this dilemma when I've seen incidents happen in public where, as like a woman, I don't feel safe intervening in like a physical fight between men, or like a man I don't know, seeming to be harassing a woman. So sometimes, like, if there's other people around me, there's safety in numbers, and safety and power and solidarity in addressing these types of issues. The third is to document. So that's the thing I was saying about, you can just pull out your phone, and sometimes that will let people know that you're watching, and they'll stop doing that. But if you need to document it and pull out that documentation later, that's also really valuable to have. And then delay, so just like kind of like distracting, just like pushing aside the incident to like happen at a later time. And then direct. So these are all a bunch of ways that you can address it. You don't have to use all of these strategies in one incident, but whatever you feel comfortable with, and whatever it seems right for the situation. And there's lots more resources on this. I'm by no means an expert. I've just looked into it myself because I've had to deal with these types of situations.
Thanks for unpacking that for us, Cathy. And I want to dive in, as we're starting to wrap here, what are those resources, whether somebody wants to know a little bit more about how to be a better, ally and work up courage as a bystander, or maybe somebody who needs to reach out about an incident that happened to them, whether they just wanted to talk to a peer or actually, file a report. Like, where can people go? What are websites or maybe even hotlines that folks can access?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the first big one that's collecting a lot of incident reports about anti-Asian hate is Stop AAPI Hate. This is the one that has collected over 1,500 reports as of April. So if you go to their website, you can submit incident reports in English as well as a number of Asian languages. So that way, perhaps your parents or other members of AAPI communities can report what's happening to them or people that they see. Really good bystander intervention training series that's been tailored towards anti-Asian sentiment during COVID has been put out by Hollaback. And this is in collaboration with AAJC, or Asian Americans Advancing Justice. And they have a free bystander training online where they walk through the 5 Ds that I just briefly walked through. And they talk about the different types of disrespect that Asian Americans are facing that happen at very different levels, like you've been saying, Amanda, from microaggressions to straight out racist comments or even physical attacks. Another thing that might be useful for folks is the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans has put out a social media toolkit. So they have sample messages for people to post on social media. They have talking points for organizations. They have a bunch of graphics on discrimination and racism during COVID, actions that people can take, ways to address mental health, ways that workers can deal with mental health issues at this time. So a bunch of just resources that you can pull directly and use in your own communities and in your own like online networks, for example. And on a more personal level and on a more like mental health level, there's some really great communities of Asian American folks online that are revolving around mental health, whether it's specific to COVID or more general. One good one is Asian Mental Health Collective, or Subtle Asian Mental Health. If y'all remember, there was like this huge Facebook page that came together that was called Subtle Asian Traits. It's like a lot of memes about being Asian. But from that stemmed off this actually like really useful group where people just talk about their experiences with mental health, things that they're dealing with their parents, with their just general like identity and the condition of being Asian American at this time. And they have a website, they have a Facebook page that you can join, and people just post to it. And it seems to be actually a really helpful space for people that might not have an Asian American community otherwise to talk about things that they're feeling and that they're thinking. This collective also has a bunch of resources that you can access. They have crisis hotlines that you can call. One thing I think is really cool is they have a really cohesive database of Asian mental health professionals and organizations that you can reach out to if you want to get help. And this is really important because a lot of the issues that Asian Americans have faced with accessing mental health services in the past is that there's not a lot of like culturally responsive mental health service providers out there. And here is a centralized location where you can access a lot of those. And then finally, there's the Association of Asian Pacific Community Health Organizations that has put together a resource guide on mental health and substance abuse more broadly. So this is in collaboration with a bunch of national AAPI organizations and community health centers, and they're providing easy access to resources and research on AAPI mental health. So those are just a number of starting places that you might look to if you're an Asian American person or even just an ally who wants to learn more about how to address these issues of racism and mental health issues that emerge from that during this time.
Thanks for outlining those resources, Cathy. I think sometimes like the hardest part of even knowing where to start is knowing where to start. And I think that even just relaying, this kind of factual information, like links, numbers, like hopefully folks, who are kind of struggling or didn't know where to ask questions or how to get information can have some of these, good points of starting. And hopefully that will lead to, positive change for them and for their friends and for their community. I really enjoyed, the conversation that we've been having for the past hour. I think that some of the highlights and some of the takeaways that I've gotten, from our conversation is that, this is a group effort and it can only be done if we do it together. And this is, all communities of color, and white communities as well. Like, we need to just understand that not only listening to the AAPI community during this time, but also listening to other communities of color will make us in all just stronger. There are so many layered levels of racial disparities and racial aggression that happen in society. Like we discussed, everything from a dirty look while riding the subway to not being able to access proper health care, to being assaulted on the street. Like, these are all things that are so real, not only for you and me, our, AAPI community and other communities of color. And I just think it's so important to recognize that, this is something that we can all solve together. And I think it starts at the level of people being willing to listen. And so having this conversation with you, I just feel like really enlivened, my hope and desire to make these things change. And I'm curious, Cathy, what did you kind of like take away from our conversation, and what kind of a lasting message do you want to leave with our viewers?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really loved having this conversation with you, and I really want to encourage other folks that are watching or that are not watching right now to also open up these conversations with your friends, your Asian American friends, with your non-Asian American friends, with your families, with people you work with. Like, I think the best thing we can do is start to talk about things and start to process things together. And I think one big thing I've taken away is that our experiences and our feelings are valid, and they need to be validated by people outside of ourselves. And that's why this building of community is really important. And then again, basically what you said, I think this moment of anti-Asian racism and xenophobia is just sort of a reflection of the broader issues that we're dealing with in the US in terms of race, about racial inequality, about oppressive systems that, of course, on an individual level, we can't really address. On a communal level, as community organizers, standing in solidarity with one another, we can start to push policymakers to start tackling some of these issues. So I think there's a lot of hope here, even though we're dealing with a lot of darkness at the same time. And I just encourage everyone to talk with others about this too.
Thanks for that, Cathy. And before we end this stream and we log off today, I just wanted to let the viewers know right now, if you enjoyed this conversation and you're interested in learning more, or you want maybe your friends to tune in next time, we're having a kind of a part 2 on this topic of anti-Asian hate in the era of COVID and even before that. I'm going to be speaking with the executive director of the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council. Her name is Manjusha Kulkarni, and she's going to give us more of a policy-centered lens on what this all means. I know that Cathy and I have been talking a little bit about how speaking about these things and, showing our lawmakers that we care and that things need to be done about these things will hopefully shift things on a legislative level. And so for folks who want to learn how, employers can train their employees to, for racial bias, or what kind of legislation could actually protect, communities of color, Manjusha and I are going to be discussing a little bit of that, and hopefully answer some of, your guys' questions about that. But yeah, it was really lovely speaking with you today, Cathy. I appreciate you coming on and imparting all of your knowledge and wisdom. And thank you so much for sharing some of those personal anecdotes. It's just really nice to connect with a peer and also a fellow member of the AAPI community.
Yeah, it was great talking to you.
Bye.